All right, I want to welcome everyone to the panel room. Today we've got a bunch of great guests here, and we're talking about alternate history. So before we get started, let's go around the room and have everyone introduce themselves. I'll go ahead and start with you, Pip.
Hi, I'm Phillipa Ballantyne. I'm originally from New Zealand, living in Virginia now for 10 years, which I can hardly believe. I'm the co-author with my husband, T. Morris, of the Ministry of Peculiar Occurrences, but I also write fantasy by myself under the name Phillipa.
Thank you. And then Leanna.
Hello, I'm Leanna Rene Heiber, and I am an author of Gothic gas lamp fantasy, and my series is the Strangely Beautiful series. I have the Magic Most Foul series, the Eternophiles, and most recently the Spectral City series, set in 1899 Manhattan with a group of lady psychics trying to save the day with the help of their favorite friendly ghosts. So come to me with all your ghost story needs.
All right, and Larry.
Hi, I'm Larry Martin. I'm an author and co-author. I write on my own science fiction and portal fantasy, and with my partner Gail Z. Martin, we also write steampunk, historical adventure, humorous monster hunter stories, and post-apocalyptic adventures.
All right, T.
So I'm T. Morris. I'm the other half of the T and Pip show, which we take on the road. And we also do on occasion every 2 weeks on The Shared Desk, which is a podcast that you can find out more about at theshareddesk.com. We also are the hosts of Tales from the Archives, which is a podcast anthology where it is set in the steampunk universe of the Ministry of Peculiar Occurrences. And when I'm not writing steampunk with my wife or on my own, or writing science fiction and fantasy on my own, a lot of people know me for stuff like this. This is Twitch for Dummies. Twitch for Dummies came out in 2019. Podcasting for Dummies, the 4th edition, is coming out in the fall of 2020. And from the spring of 2020, Discord for Dummies came out. So right now you can go out and get what I'm calling the trifecta of content creation, where I teach you Discord, Twitch, and podcasting all under the Dummies moniker. And that is just a sampling of what I do, whether I'm with Pip or dangerously on my own.
All right, thank you. And Nancy.
I'm Nancy Northcott. I'm a pretty much lifelong science fiction, fantasy, and comic book geek. And being a history geek got thrown in there somehow, which my husband thinks is really weird, but he's learned to live with it. And I write the historical fantasy series, The Boar King's Honor, for Falstaff Books. And this is the first book, The Herald of Day, which is out now. And it's set in the reign of Charles II and does actually involve changing history. So I always have fun with that and finding out where, and I'm looking forward to talking to everybody about that tonight.
All right, thank you. And last but not least, Nikki.
Hi, my name is Nikki Woolfolk. I write steampunk. I also write steampunk cozy murder mysteries, always involving food. So I have a series out, well, at least started the series. The first book is Maison Death. It's the Bittersweet Mysteries. It's book 1. And that is about a amateur sleuth, chocolatier who solves murder mysteries with her possible maybe girlfriend. We're not sure. We're at the beginning stages of that. Also, I write comedic contemporary romance with an all-black cast. So that's my Blurred Girl series as well. And also with my steampunk, I do novellas, which are usually about 75, 80 pages long, and they're always filled with food. There's a plot, but it's always with food.
All right, thanks so much.
Whoa. No. Nikki's not done yet. Nikki also makes chocolate. That is so good. Your eyes roll back in your head so far, you can see out of the back of your head. It is that good.
And I'm also a professional chocolatier.
Thank you. Thank you, Nikki.
Thank you. Don't forget the chocolate.
Anything that's in my books, I end up making the chocolate from there and I sell it. So I have a little shop as well.
Oh, wow.
We changed the name to Belmont Chocolates. So you can see us online.
All right.
Chocolates, that's what I pretty much push.
And now I can see why there's food in all of your stories. All right, so before we get into alt history, while researching this, I found a lot of different terms, and I'm going to throw this out to everyone. Could we like define some of these terms? Because, you know, of course, you got historical fantasy, you've got gas lamp, steampunk, and I'm sure a bunch of others that I'm missing in there. Probably thousands of them, it seems. Who wants to jump in and kind of give an overview of what these terms are going to mean while we're talking?
I'll take Gaslamp Fantasy because that's basically what I do specifically. Gaslamp Fantasy was created as a way to differentiate it from steampunk, not in any way that wanted to be disassociated with it, in terms of it's not a negative disassociation, but just for readers who are looking for fantasy elements. One of the main gists of steampunk is that there's alternate tech. So if you have 19th century set science fiction, it's going to fall more into the steampunk category. For those of us who are writing 19th century set gas lamp era set books like myself that have fantasy elements, paranormal, ghosts, psychic stuff, prophecies, magical things, that is much more of a fantasy trope. So Gaslamp Fantasy is what I'm doing, where I'm taking that 19th century gaslit era feel and atmosphere, but I'm solving problems with magic and paranormal aspects rather than technological aspects, which is more reserved for the wonderful, you know, cogs and wheels and gears of steampunk itself.
Okay.
I'll
Anyone
jump on
else?
the alternate history one.
Okay.
Because I like there's a lot of blurred lines between all these different things. Like you can have steampunk that is alternate history. Like in our ministry series, there are many things that are different to how the actual history rolled out, but it is still classed as steampunk. But obviously, alternate history is where, you know, the Americans didn't win the Revolutionary War. I've been thinking a lot about that lately. I'm working on a series, for example, that's sort of set in the Regency period in England, where there is a block of forest, old growth forest, that is a sort of well of magic. And how would, it's been bending my mind thinking about, so how would that affect, you know, their politics, their culture, all the arts and all of that sort of thing. So I think alternate history is, you know, there's usually one thing, big thing that's changed, and then you have to sort of pass that out and see how that rolls out.
My biggest hang up with the whole term of alternate history, of trying to find to define these genres, that I feel like we're almost taking a sifter to the genre itself, and we're starting to, whether it's consciously or unconsciously, separate ourselves from the genre of science fiction. Case in point, there was an alternate history show that popped up on Apple TV that completely caught me off guard, because I didn't expect it to be as good as it was. But could I call it alternate history? It'd be like, no, this is science fiction. The show is called For All Mankind, and it opens with the moon landing. And within 5 minutes, you suddenly realize, oh, wait, the Americans are not landing on the moon, it's the Russians. And when you see, it's the Soviets, yes. Thank you, darling. And as you see the snowball effects of this, and I kept watching this thinking, wow, this is terrific alternate history. And then I remember catching myself and going, yeah, but this is still science fiction. And I think sometimes when people say, oh, you know, what do you write? And, you know, if I tell people, well, I write steampunk, they don't get that. If I tell them I write alternate history, they don't get that. In our circles, yeah, they would get that. They understand that. But what I'm talking about on mainstream media, they don't get alternate history. So I just tell people I write science fiction. And I actually have been called to the mat. People go, you don't write science fiction, you write steampunk. And I went, oh, is there a difference? And that's when I get the blah, 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 blah. You know, it's one of my biggest hangups in writing this style or this approach to science fiction, because it's still science fiction. It's just science fiction I mean, I'm old enough to remember that when Disney made the film 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, no one ever called it alternate history. No one called it steampunk. It was science fiction. So I still think there's a place there's a place where we can just stop trying to find a pigeonhole perfect genre for what we do and just call it what it is.
Like to hang their hats on things too. That's fine.
I know.
I'm allowed to disagree with you because I'm, across the room from you.
That's what you do, baby. That's what you do.
Like
I like it so much I put a ring on it, okay? So you can back off.
Yeah, it's just like being in a regular panel.
Besides, Nikki was off the market, so I had to make do, all right? So,
Oh, and thank you and good night.
I'd like to pick up on what T just said, because when you look at historical fantasy, when I started doing market research on that, I assumed that what it meant, and what I mean when I say it, is historical in the sense of Earth history, some point in actual Earth history. It can be as modern as the Victorian age, or I guess now the First World War, or it can go all the way back to before people wrote things. But when I went to research the market for that, I found that on a lot of the vendor sites, what was labeled historical fantasy took place in imaginary worlds, completely imaginary worlds, that had a lot in common with different periods of Earth history. So I think a lot of this is, like you were saying, it's kind of what people hear when they hear it, rather than what we necessarily understand it to mean when we say it.
I would add to that, I think you could actually have an entire panel just on categorizing your work and what labels you put, because there isn't really a right answer unless you're just trying to reach a particular market or get a certain reader. Even ours, while we had the Iron and Blood series, which is steampunk, I would also agree it's science fiction. It is also paranormal. So it depends on your reader. We often just tell people, if you liked Wild Wild West, it's in that vein of Jules Verne. It is an action adventure with weird tech, ghosts, and maybe aliens.
I like that. Can I speak up about steampunk?
Sure.
For me, I do like Wild Wild West. That was my favorite show. I know I'm dating myself. I have very particular episodes that are my favorite. But for me, when I started seeing in science fiction that they talked about steampunk, I was like, oh, what's that? And then I realized, okay, it's Wild Wild West, but in written form. But one of the things I noticed is that even though the gadgets were really inventive and really awesome, what I noted is the history was exactly the same as what we have here. So it was like gadgets, but there was still, this history that, there are some things I personally would like to change and some other people would like to change. So when it came to steampunk, I love the engineering. I love the tech of it because that's my background. I grew up with science fiction and, grew up on a naval base right next to the research NASA station, all sorts of different things like that in the computer world. But for me, I thought, I was like 11, and I remember thinking, what would we be like as a society, as people of color, as Black people? What would have happened if the slave revolts actually were successful? And what would have happened if there was no civil war? How much would we grow as a society? How much tech we would have so much of, because a lot of the men folk were not killed, the women were not killed. You have all these great minds suddenly coming together because this war is not there. So I work with steampunk in that way. So it is an alternate history, the what if, as well as giving a few guidelines where you can do like touches of history, where you're pulling from like the 1800s and certain inventions that did happen, but at the same time, making it your own, twisting it around and coming up with the gadgets. I mean, I loved one gadget so much, even though it never existed in the 1800s, but I needed to kill off a character because I write murder mysteries. So I killed off one of the characters with a Rube Goldberg machine. It was nice and loud. It was great. And it happens in the airship. So you can't get any more steampunk than that.
No.
And the Wild Wild West, I'm assuming you're speaking about is the older TV show, not the movie.
It's not older.
We do not speak of the movie. We
That
do
never
not
happened in
speak of
this
the movie.
timeline.
We do not
But,
speak
Yeah,
of the
it
movie.
didn't happen.
Yeah. The show was something that my mother introduced me to. So that was a big deal. I got into science fiction because of my mom. We used to watch Twilight Zone together, and now I understand, oh, that's considered speculative fiction. It's like, well, it's still science fiction, but then we have all these little niches, all these little moments. So I think too, having that discerning ability allows us to put in keywords when we're, pushing a book.
So I got to ask real quick, completely non sequitur. Nikki, have you seen the new Twilight Zone with Jordan Peele?
I haven't yet.
Oh,
You're gonna like it.
So good.
so freaking good. Jordan Peele, right? Somewhere in the afterlife, Rod Serling is going, that young man is doing an absolutely bang up job. I mean, he's just, he's
one of those things where I haven't gotten to watch it because I'm binge watching other things. Yeah, all the things. But I think when it came to like Twilight Zone, I remember being a kid and my mother would use science fiction as a way to talk about emotions, current events. We'd watch the ones from the 60s, the original one, and she would say, okay, based on this storyline, what year was this done? What was going on in history at the actual time? What are they trying to convey, not just on the surface level, but also deeper? So that's how I got more of an understanding that science fiction is a reflection of what's going on. And steampunk can be a part of that since it is part of science fiction.
Very much so.
To do the what if. I wanted to give more hope because we usually know with Jules Verne, it's always filled with a lot of hope. So I thought, well, what happens if I give some of my ancestors a moment of hope and it reveals itself in technology? Because everybody likes gadgets in steampunk.
Great.
I love that. And I think that the what if really is what draws all of this together. I think that we have all of these little genre delineations basically to manage reader expectations sometimes, because I find that if people really like a tech heavy book with a lot of gadgets and with a lot of science fiction elements, they're probably not going to like my work as much because my work is much more fantasy minded in how I solve problems. But what is definitely true for everyone under the grand umbrella of sci-fi and fantasy is that what if. And it really does, like just like Nikki said, it really does allow us to talk about the things going on right now in a way that fiction as metaphor many times does a much better job at trying to actually get at the problem, for people to be able to read it and distance themselves just enough to be able to consider that what if in terms of positive change and hope.
Now, kind of playing off of that, and again, this can go out to all of you. With alternate history, obviously, as you said, and I'm using alternate history just as the catch-all for all of them, you pick a point of divergence, some point that things change from how they progressed in our world. How easy or hard is it to write a divergent world when we grew up in the world the way things actually progressed? Because does that influence it to the point where you really can't give that alternate world a legitimate shot, I guess, for lack of a better term?
I think when you're doing what we do, in particular when you're talking about that point of divergence, you have to ask yourself, okay, so how far does this technology, how far can it advance? And what I've personally seen in writing steampunk is that it's amazing how ahead of the curve some of these imaginations and some of these scientists were back in the turn of the century. I think one of the coolest things that Pip and I discovered was that there was the because electricity was all the fad, and because they were already creating steam powered vehicles and gasoline powered vehicles. There was an Edison electric vehicle that is no different than the Nissan Leaf that my wife and I drive. And on a full charge, it could go 100 miles in distance. And now, granted,
wasn't quite as fast.
nor was the battery as small as the one that we
No,
have, obviously. But the fact that actually existed, just mind blowing.
Well, that's the kind of thing when you have those, you discover those sort of historical things that just fire it off, and you're like, no one ever teaches you that stuff in school or in college, and you're like, that is fascinating, and that's what really gets your mind going.
And where I think we work a little harder than say when you've got I'm just using this as a counterpoint. I had a lot of problems with what a lot of people are calling the geek touchstone of literature, which is Ready Player One. And one of my biggest problems with Ready Player One is that apparently there is no pop culture for like a 50-year time span. So then pretty much every pop culture reference is something from the 80s. And I'm like, that really, and I will say this, Spielberg and the screenwriters fixed that in the film, because you had references to other popular pop culture things, but still went from a 50-year gap to a 30-year gap. And yet, but when we're writing and we're basically taking today's technology and throwing it back into the 19th century or even further on, we're still making it part of the culture. And I think that is the real challenge in what we do, is that the technology should not be just something like, oh, look, there's an airship. And then suddenly it's steampunk. It's like, no, how is the airship changing the culture? How is the airship changing how is the airship changing transportation? How is it changing cross cultures? How would the empire, the British Empire, differ? How would America differ? If it's, and so, you come up with the ways that technology isn't just there as a centerpiece. That was how steampunk didn't happen. Charles Babbage made this beautiful difference engine, and nobody got behind it. But when culture stepped behind computers, suddenly computers are everywhere. So that's the concept that we're running with here. And when you make your technology part of the culture, I think that really changes how you can easily create an iPod in the 19th century, a wireless computer in the 19th century, because it's now part of the culture. And it's frightening how easy you can make that happen.
I used to teach a course in science fiction, fantasy, and society at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Sweet. And what T was saying reminded me of reading Fahrenheit 451 with the class. Because you may remember how absorbed Montag's wife is in the equivalent of a wall-sized soap opera. And what surprised me about it was not only with that book, but with The Caves of Steel, how many bits of the technology and the attitudes resonated with the students. I don't remember when those books were written, but I think it was sometime in the 1960s. And I was teaching this in the early 00s. And yet the students picked up on those things because Ray Bradbury and Isaac Asimov tapped into some sort of universal understanding that made it real to them. I mean, I thought I was going to have to work to pull them into these books. I love them, but that doesn't mean that people a lot younger than I am are going to love them. And they really got into them because it was relatable. It fit within a reality in the book, and it fit within a reality that they knew.
So should we try to separate out the real world, what we know as the real world, from this fantasy that we're doing? Because you go back to Nikki's, when she was talking about watching The Twilight Zone, it turned into these conversations about that. So should we remove it when you're talking steampunk, historical fiction, alt history? Or should that still, influence our view of this alternate world?
Well, I think
For my part, I very much want to have a. Did you guys hear me? Sorry.
Mhm.
Yep.
I think I had an internet glitch. I very much want to lift up the foremothers who were advocating for equality and civil rights across many different marginalizations that were existent in the late 19th century. And so a lot of our understanding of modern civil rights is not a 20th century thing. It was begun in the 19th century by a lot of different people across many different identities. And so I really enjoy lifting up examples and sort of parallel, kind of taking my cue from history and creating a diverse group of people who are fighting for change, and they're utilizing paranormal things which allow avenues for them that weren't necessarily, at least on the surface, available for people in the 19th century. Although the interest in the occult and the interest in seances, the interest in spiritualism, I make that very real for my characters. That was a real obsession of the 19th century, and it did allow for women to be mediums and public speakers. That directly ties into the women's rights movement. And especially in a place like New York City, where most of my books are set, or at least partially set, the space where different minds are coming in from all around the world, and it is such a cross-cultural mecca. There's just such a wonderful place from real New York history to talk about the elements of people coming together to save the day, and also things that we're still struggling with in terms of equality, justice, for any marginalization. We're still talking about these things, so it's resonant today. But the 19th century was also still talking about them. So I'm interested in trying to remind people that feminism is not a modern thing. It is, it has been going on for centuries. And there have been voices and advocates for equality and justice throughout all of history, fighting for it. And, do I like to pair that with a great action adventure with lots of ghosts? Absolutely. But in a lot of ways, those things can help, like we're talking about with science and fantasy, make these ongoing struggles something that we can continue to examine, turn the facets of, as we continue to chew on these big life questions about how can we have a better society.
I think every convention that you and I have been to, Leanna, I always lean across and go, New Zealand gave women the right to vote first in the world. I miss doing that this year, so I get to do it this year. But yeah, I don't think we don't write in a vacuum. We are all writers, all products of our world. And so you cannot help but have some of the hard questions, some of the thoughts of the author kind of bleeding across. I mean, we did the second book of the ministry was basically all about suffragettes. And there were a lot of New Zealanders in there. And I had great joy in bringing the preeminent suffragette in New Zealand, bring her across into our book. Of course, she'd had an accident and she had a steam-powered jaw, but that was, apart from that, she was basically the same character. So I think that the role of any good fiction is to make you think, even if you're having fun and swinging from airships at the same time.
I'd also add, I think it depends on the story you're telling and the characters in your story. So in our steampunk, we have a strong female character. So those issues are very prevalent to the book because that's what the character will care about. And so bringing in those elements are really what tells the story and what do your characters have interest in, or would they be paying attention to that furthers the plot of what you're trying to get across.
All right, and piggybacking off of that, we'll start with you, Larry. Let's let the audience know where your point of divergence is in your books and why you guys picked it.
So the most relevant is probably Iron and Blood and the companion series, the Storm and Fury Adventures, which is primarily the technology and an alternate history starting in the mid 1800s that changed the landscape due to some natural disasters that just basically rewrote how some of the world's powers interacted and how the United States, ours is US based, went on a different path. And the petroleum industry didn't get the backing and power that they did in real history. Because let's face it, many of the world's events are driven by where's the money and who is investing and squelching other technology. So that's really where we deviated.
Okay. T, how about you?
So I think the real diversion, I think Pip and I kind of touched on it, was we looked at a common touchstone. If Charles Babbage had been given the backing to create the analytical engine, how would that have changed? How would that have changed society? How would society have evolved if that sort of technology really did get backing?
But as it turned out in our young adult series, Darling, that comes across earlier, there was actual steam-powered technology in ancient times, and it was destroyed mysteriously.
Right.
So he was really just rediscovering it.
Right. I don't think we've reached that part yet in the series, but we're getting there. We're getting there. We will. We will. Spoiler.
All right, Nancy, how about you?
Well, I take a little bit of a different approach because my books are set in historical time periods. But with the Herald of Day, the problem is that the villain has gone back and changed history so that the mage-born or magically gifted are in charge. To him, letting people without magical gifts run society is letting chickens run the lions. And so I needed to find a point of divergence where that would make sense, that you could make those kind of societal alterations. And I've always been interested in Charles II, and there's a historical theme in the book, The Mystery of the Princes in the Tower, and the bones in Westminster Abbey, which, if I can climb on my soapbox for a moment, are not actually the bones of the princes in the tower, but are labeled as such, were discovered in the reign of Charles II. And so I used that as part of the time travel linkage. But when I looked at the history, Oliver Cromwell ruled England with an iron fist, and he was unfortunately succeeded by his son, who followed the historical pattern of a strong figure followed by an inept related successor. And it was his ineptitude that opened the door for the Restoration and the reign of Charles II, who was invited back to take the throne. So I thought, well, what if this wizard discovered how to travel history and he needed an incident to change? So he killed Oliver Cromwell's son and then ingratiated himself with Cromwell so that he became Cromwell's heir when Cromwell died. So it was like, okay, what point in this historical period can I muck with that will let me do what I want? And then the book is about the characters trying to figure out what happened, how did it happen, and can we fix it? So a lot of times, a lot hinges on one event. You give Richard III another 10 yards at Bosworth Field, you don't get the Tudors. You know, so it's a lot of things like, as Nikki was saying, if the slave revolts succeed, the world has a very different look to it. If there is no civil war and African Americans are able to use their creativity and contribute to society instead of being stomped on all the time, how much better off would we be? And so I think if you read a little history, you don't have to be a geek to find an inflection point. Just read it and look for it. Did I actually answer your question? I kind of got going there, so anyway.
Yes,
okay,
definitely.
right, thank you.
All right, Nikki, how about you with yours?
I think partially when I started writing steampunk, as I had mentioned before, it was mainly not seeing representation. And I remember doing a panel with Leanna and Gail and Ashley, and one of the questions was like, why are your characters Black in steampunk? And I'm like, why are yours not? And not only that, but I wrote the story that I wanted to read, mainly because in our own world, when it comes to talking about Black history or African American history, it starts off with, you all were slaves. No, we were enslaved. It doesn't mean that that's how our world started. And not only that, but we look at history and how it's explained, and you go from mentioning Black people during the Civil War, and then we're sitting at lunch counters. I'm like, so where's Waldo with the Black people? Like, suddenly we went from the Civil War, we like hid out somewhere, and then now we're trying to sit at lunch counters. Like, there's a lot of history that happened in between then. A lot of it is heartbreaking, but also a lot of it is amazing. A lot of inventions were happening. A lot of patents, despite the fighting against us, we were able to, basically make so many different things. And I wanted to work with that. I wanted to showcase that in my steampunk, that, instead of it being all this one homogenized, it's like, you do know that, there were women ranchers. I know because my great aunts were, and most of my family can ride horses like there's no business. My current family, not so much. But as far as, being in the sciences and doing all those things, we are not acknowledged in that time frame between the 1850s and to the 1960s. And so it's like, well, let's take this little piece of chunk in history. And yes, we're still making up things, but at the same time, I wanted to really showcase the engineering side, what was going on in aviation at the time. So it was one of those things of, I am a trivia nut. So if you ever need like Tuesday night trivia at the bar, I'm your person. Like, seriously.
Make a note, Pip. Make a note. Make a note.
And I always tell my husband, I'm like, I am like full of useless information, but if you need it, I got it. So that was one of the things that I noticed. And I wanted to make sure that in the steampunk, if you're writing about heavy events, I don't want to depress you, because I can depress myself when I write it. So I write about things that are a bit on the heavy side, but I use humor. It's one of those things. I remember Richard Pryor had said, people are less likely to punch you in the face if you make them laugh. So, which is true, because it's like, people, they can be mad at you, but if you make them laugh, it's really hard for them to stay mad at you. So that was the way that I introduced my steampunk world, where instead of it being where we are only seen as slaves, instead seeing us as the human beings that we are and the contributions that we've given to, the United States. And that was my focus. And that's always been my focus. Yeah.
I think that is something that science fiction does extremely well, is not only provide people with, is that it provides us with an opportunity to fill in some of the blanks. As you were talking, Nikki, the first thing that came to mind when you said, wait, nothing happened between the Civil War and the lunch counters, the first thing that came to mind was when Pip and I were watching on HBO, The Watchmen. And when that opening happened with Tulsa, I was like, oh, okay. I'm Southern white kid. I'm watching this going, oh, okay, so this happened in this alternate universe.
And I said, no, it happened.
And I'm like,
I'm
what do
the
you
white chick from New Zealand, and I knew that it happened.
Yeah, she knew that it happened, and I didn't. And I was like, wait a minute, what do you mean? This actually happened? And then I started researching. And I think it's something that we as science fiction authors should be very fortunate that we have this platform. When you think about it, in the 1960s, at the height of all the racial tension that was happening in the 60s, Star Trek did that amazing episode. I remember it terrified me as a kid, and I never understood why until I saw it as an adult. And I said, because it was right in front of me. It was the episode was called "Let This Be Your Last Battlefield," and it was with the two races that were constantly at war with each other. Mm-hmm. And Frank Gorshin played the guy who would come to pick up the other dude, and he said, "Well, isn't it clear that you can tell he's lying? Why? Well, he's black on the left side of his face, not on the right side of the face." And I'm sitting there as an adult going, "Oh my God, this aired in the 60s," and it was, and you got away with it because it was science fiction. Yeah. That's the thing. We can get away with a lot because it's science fiction, and I consider us very lucky that we have that we have this platform to do it.
Thank you. Pip, do you have anything to throw in on
Well,
your stories?
I'm just gonna. Me and Nikki are gonna make a pub trivia team.
Uh,
Well, wait. What do you mean, me and Nikki?
Well, we're gonna beat you.
No. Look, you're gonna need me in there when they start going in.
Oh, that's true.
James
He is good for the
Bond
stupid movie references.
Yeah.
We'll keep you
I'm
on for
all
that.
about the stupid movie trivia. I'm on that. There's a reason she calls me IMDT, because I can just rattle off people.
I'm that person when it comes to movies. My husband pretty much knows, like, I'm the director's commentary, and I'm not a director. And I'm like, this person was tied to this person knows this
Yep.
person.
Oh my gosh. We've got it wrapped up. Next convention, we were all actually together. We'll have to do that. Yeah.
Bring chocolate.
So going back, Pip, building off of what T said on your stories, anything you want to add about the divergent point that you picked and why?
Well, T and I do the ministry together. I think he's got them well covered. My very first, well, technically first book that I ever did was set in Shakespearean England, and I'm also just a crazy history nerd, and so what if Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream was real? What if there were actually fairies? And I just, I got crazier ideas as the career went on. But yeah, I think like T said, we have an opportunity to examine really difficult sort of issues that we're dealing with in the real world and put them in a book, and it's much easier to look at and sort of get a grip on.
All right. And Leanna.
I wanted to choose the late 1800s because there's a really dynamic thing that's happening in a lot of metropolitan cities at the end of the 19th century, in that people from all different backgrounds are coming together to work in like new emergent industries. And I also consider spiritualism to be sort of an emergent industry at that point. The interest in trying to talk to the dead because of the rampant, for all of industry's advancements, medicine was lagging far behind. And between huge various medical situations, whether it was yellow fever or cholera or tuberculosis or any number of various issues, there was widespread death. And so the interest in spiritualism was coming from a very real place. And also the Civil War was a huge wound across the country, and the injustices of slavery and all of the various, it was a dark time, and it was such a time of progress and yet still so much pain. And so just psychically the country was very bruised and battered going through the 19th century. And so spiritualism became this kind of mid-century rock for people to turn to for ways to deal and to cope. The idea of a grief counselor comes through in spiritualism, and women were allowed to speak in public because of spiritualism. And people like Victoria Woodhull, the first woman to run for president in 1872 with Frederick Douglass, a Black man, as her running mate. This was happening in 1872. This is not fiction, that is real. And so, and enabled, Victoria Woodhull came up through spiritualist rankings. Now, she used them to her own advantage. And so the idea of, were people really communicating with that? Were they just using it as a platform? For me, I don't really care. It was a way that people had to get access to the ideas of a more just and equitable society. So for me, that late 19th century, spiritualism has really gotten a hold on the population. And so thusly, I have a lot of room to move. By 1880, we have our first police matrons who are employed by the NYPD. So we have women who are working in that industry. We have, by the 1890s, all of the telephone operators were women. We have women working in the visual arts. Tiffany, Comfort Tiffany's stained glass windows were all cut and designed and put together by women. Clara Driscoll designed all his lamps. There were women in the creative industrial arts. The Industrial Revolution, in addition to spiritualism, allowed for people of color and women and other marginalized folks to have maybe a way in new emergent industries as workers, thusly some social and actual financial capital to try to be able to have more of a voice in society. So in that dynamic space, I'm not necessarily diverging from that. I'm just allowing for the existence and interest in the paranormal and the industries and the new investigative branches like Secret Service and other different developments within government offices. I use those sort of a secret history. Okay, so there's this side sort of X-Files project that's happening concurrent with all of these things. And the idea that women and people of color would be employed in these spaces is not a foreign concept. It's also not historically inaccurate. So, you know, for folks who might push back and say, oh, well, you know, this stuff's too modern, it's actually really not. So I'm just diving in deeper and allowing my characters to have adventures within things that space was already being made for this by the late 19th century.
All right, thank you. And we'll start with you, Nancy, on the next one. Any bit of advice you wish you had gotten or that you did get when you were starting out writing the alternate history or historical fiction genre?
I think the advice that a lot of people should hear, it wasn't so much an issue for me because I was an undergraduate history major. I've been reading history my whole life. The advice I probably should have gotten is there are a lot of things in this history that nobody cares about but you. You know, luckily I have critique partners who will go, see this bit here, you're the only person who cares about this, take that out. But I think the complaint I hear from a lot of people is, I just don't know where to start. The history's so intimidating. Mm. And so my advice would be, don't get bogged down in it, and find a good survey text or a survey book about whatever subject it is that interests you, and what appeals to you in that will tell you where to look next.
Great. Nikki.
Oh, kind of piggybacking on what Nancy had said. When I was writing Maison Death, and as I said that the murder takes place on an airship, you can't have open flames. So how do you end up having a dinner, you know, a full catered dinner from this cooking school, you know, on this airship without blowing everybody up? And so, like Nancy had said about history, I went through texts that talked about pottery and how certain different meals were made in order to make sure that I didn't have open flames in the airship, so there were no sparks. Also, in order to kill off my character, it's not a surprise. You're going to know by, you know, the end of the chapter, the first chapter. But when I kill them off and I'm using this apparatus, I also worked with an engineer friend of mine to make sure that everything was in its place. So we put just enough information so the reader doesn't get bored, but just enough for that pedantic reader that's going to point out everything wrong. I made sure that it was engineeringly sound, so everything fit. So it wasn't just, okay, this is used as a murder weapon, but also we're making sure that what's being cooked in the cuisine. So I end up writing like a, I don't know, 9-course cuisine out of this based on Mediterranean food and that sort of thing. But I end up using pottery in order to get what I needed. So it was that kind of odd, this probably doesn't belong anywhere, this is weird history, but in order to make sure that that opening chapter worked and there were no issues, I had to go back with that. But yeah, I love putting down like all this food history, and nobody cares. Nobody cares. So I write the first chapter and the first draft for me with all sorts of food, and then I edit the crap out of it for the second. So yeah. So I write the history for me, just like you write it for you, and then we move on.
Apparently, unless you've fed them some of that food, and then they all love it, from what I'm hearing.
Aw.
Correct.
Next, Pip.
I would say when you're researching your history, find a character that you want to hang out with. Like there are some wacky people, especially in the 19th century, that you just read about them and you're like, I just have to have them in a book. I want to hang out with these people. I love a good eccentric, and the 19th century seemed to be largely eccentric people wandering around. The great age of the amateur everything, amateur biologists and amateur, engineers and all of this sort of stuff. And I would just find a character that you're going to love and hang out with, and you can, if you want to like geek out, be the history nerd, then you can geek out about their life and put all those little bits in there. But yeah, you'll find somebody fun.
All right, Leanna.
I think much like as has been said, like finding something that you can really obsess about, but that is also relevant to your plot, because all of these details are wonderful, but if they don't somehow do at least double or triple duty in letting you know a character moment, reveal something about both the people that are in your story as well as the plot of your story, those details aren't doing as much service as they can, because if the details do become irrelevant, then people will tend to check out. So you can, if you're getting overwhelmed by history, one of the things that I found to be helpful was just sort of spot research, the things that were directly relevant to my character, the things that they were going to have to know, and the other things that they didn't have to know, you know what, that's not on my plate for this book. So being able to sort of hunt and peck through things that work for the overarching plot that you're doing. And then another thing too is there's so much rich and wonderful history, but if you are writing outside of your experience, if you are writing outside of your identity, it is very important to get a sensitivity reader. I employ 4 of them for my Spectral City series, from different identities. The trans woman that I have as one of my female psychics. I have a trans woman, good friend of mine, Ashley, who Nikki mentioned earlier, who's my sensitivity reader for Antonia, my trans character. Again, she has different language for herself and her identity and her truth, but it's not as though trans folks didn't exist. Folks have always existed, of all kinds, and all identities have always existed. The language and the way in which that's been accepted or not has changed through history. It's never been a static thing. But again, that's not my experience. So I want to make sure that I sort of look at my books as the idea of harm no other, do what you will, right? A great law. So the idea of harming no other being at the forefront of that. I have a Jewish sensitivity reader for my hero, who is a Jewish detective. That is not my experience, but you cannot talk about New York history without talking about Jewish history and Jewish contributions. So, I wanted to make sure that was present. I have a biracial sensitivity reader for Cora, one of my other female psychics. And I really think that it's important for folks to make sure that stuff that just didn't occur to you occurred to me as a white woman, making sure that I'm not, in my efforts to be inclusive, I don't want those spots of privilege or not being attentive to some of the nuance that's there. There can be a lot of cultural appropriation in steampunk, and so we want to make sure that we, as in our work, that we're not just taking things that we think are lovely and wonderful, but taking out of context in a way that doesn't actually serve the story or isn't actually fair to the folks that it's trying to represent. So representation is great, but doing it sensitively and with nuance and culturally with that other eye, other than yourself, looking at these characters' experiences and doing your best, and then hoping that in that it can reflect the type of hope and ingenuity and an incredible opportunity that we are all drawn to this genre for.
All right, thank you. Larry, your advice.
It's less advice than a learning, and that is when we started writing the alternative history Pittsburgh, one thing we did is we actually visited most of the sites we used in the book, actually walked them. So we went to the Homestead Cemetery and we actually walked out the battle scene. It did disconcert the docent a little. We had warned her, so she knew what we were doing and why, but there was still a little bit of side eye there. But we actually walked it out so that if anyone was familiar with the real history or the real places, it made sense and they could see it or put themselves in this situation. And that is one of the things that we've tried to do now with most of our stories is, I mean, Google Earth is great and some satellite pictures help, but if you can actually go there and see it, it really adds to some of the believability of the story that you're not saying a lot. It's the little things that you see or observe being in the space you're writing about.
Now, do you take pictures? Do you note smells, all that stuff? Or what do you tend to do when you go to the locations?
Normally we're plotting because a lot of it's action. So we're looking, okay, where can you hide? Where can the bad guy come out and shoot at you? What would be damaged? You know, what's in the space? Also, what are the backgrounds that are near the space you're at that you wouldn't know if you weren't there? So you might have a site that you're actually near the train station. You know, well, you don't see the train station, but you can hear it. So you might need to include that in your story. So it's those kind of things. It's the not obvious that you pick up when you're actually there, that you see it.
All right, thank you so much. And T.
So I'm bringing up the rear on this one, which means I'm probably going to end on a Debbie Downer note. But one of the things that you have to contend with, especially in steampunk, is inconvenient or uncomfortable history. In the very first ministry, and I'm surprised many people didn't pick up on it, we dealt with colonialism straight up. It was the first thing we dealt with. Eliza got prejudiced because she was from New Zealand. She was a colonial, and that was the whole idea behind the Phoenix Society. In the second book, we dealt with sexism. We dealt with misogyny. We dealt with, and not only did we deal with that, we dealt with sexism from someone of the same sex, and that was something, again, that apparently people just kind of, they were so invested in it. No one ever called us out on it or anything like that, but we dealt with it head on. In the third one, we dealt with racism because we were in the United States and it was post-Civil War, and we dealt with that. But it was the fifth book that really challenged us.
I felt like we were doubling down every time, actually.
Yeah, well, I mean, we didn't deal with it so much in the fourth book, but that was mainly because the fourth book was sort of like Mission Impossible, more like a Mission Impossible Ghost Recon, where, you know, where basically the entire, pardon, spoiler alert, the entire ministry was disavowed. And, you know, and so really I think the only thing we really dealt with was stereotypes from New Zealand. It was hot. There are two types of weather in Australia: hot and bloody hot and wet. You know, that was, you know, I was like, okay, and we did get some blowback from that from Australian
some
readers.
Australians came at me. It's okay.
Yeah, come at me, bro. But in the fifth one, we had to deal with it because we were setting this in India, and when you're setting steampunk in India, we had to sit down and we had to go, okay, you know, how far do we go with this? And
I think we had to go all in.
We went all
Can't
in,
really avoid it.
much to the shock of our sensitivity reader, Sunadasi, which, if you don't know Sunadasi,
I love her.
Yeah,
I love her.
Sun is our girl. We love our Sunadasi.
I love
Sunadasi,
her.
for those of you who don't know, she is the web mistress of Steampunk India. Talented musician, talented writer. She just like
She wrote for us,
just like Leanna, she wrote for us in the podcast. And I remember when she wrote it, she said, "I hope you don't mind. I kind of went dark," and this is before we worked with her for the fifth book in the series, and she went, "Wow, you guys went dark," and that's coming from Suna. but the thing was, is we said, well, we really didn't have much of a choice. And I remember Suna's reaction was, well, if you put it that way, I guess you're right. You have to face uncomfortable history. And if you dance around it, you take the chance
That very limited space to go.
Well, either that or you
full of it.
either that or you create a steampunk song in the South, and nobody wants a steampunk song in the South. I'm just saying. You don't want that. And even Disney didn't want that, but at least they don't want it now. But the point I'm getting at is that if you do face uncomfortable history, don't shy away from it. Find sensitivity readers. I know there's some authors that really poo-poo on sensitivity readers, but they only make your work stronger. And if you were to ask me what was, in that original series with Books and Brawn, what was your proudest moment? I would have said it was in the Ghost Rebellion, because we shocked our sensitivity reader in the best possible way, because she didn't think that we would do that. And I'm like, but we had no choice. It's history. And she was like, yeah. That would be the advice that I would give. What were you going to say, Darren?
I think she was like shocked. You very, very white people.
Yeah. and just one more thing. I wouldn't say too that your history has to help you tell a good story. History has to help you tell a good story. And when it's inconvenient, that's just fodder for a really good story, because it creates tension, it creates drama, it creates conflict. And I've seen a lot of authors kind of take a sidestep to it. And remember, we're not just talking about airships and ray guns and ether collectors and all kinds of cool gadgetry, or gaslight gadgetry in Leanna's respect. We're talking about uncomfortable history. We're talking about tension. We're talking about the British Empire and India. They were not going to let that go. And when you're writing a book called The Ghost Rebellion, you got to deal with it. And I think the more you deal with it, the better your writing is going to be.
And where would you suggest someone look for sensitivity readers? Excuse me.
There's this beautiful place called the internet.
There are actual places now where you can go and hire sensitivity readers if you don't know any, like in the community.
But I would say double check their credentials. Always, there's nothing wrong with doing a deep dive into somebody's credentials. We didn't just pick Suna Dasi out of a hat. We said, well, let's look at Steampunk India. Let's look at how deep she goes. And for those of you who, like Leanna, those of you who know Suna, you're like, wow, she lives and breathes this stuff. Then you find out she's got a Dutch background and she's also Scottish. It's like, well, bonus. And she was a delight to work with. We actually had two fronts of the Ghost Rebellion. The other front was in Russia. So we asked our sensitivity reader got her degree. I think she got her master's in Russia, in Russian and Soviet history. So we were able to talk to her about what would the terrain be like, what would Russian steampunk look like.
This is the good thing about if you're in like the steampunk community or the writing community, just ask people, ask around, see who they've used,
Look at acknowledgement pages. All my sensitivity readers are always acknowledged in my acknowledgement page, and just talk to writers about it. And then folks, if you're having the conversation, publicly on social media, Twitter is a great space. A lot of publishing is on Twitter, and there's a lot of resources there and a lot of threads for people who are sensitivity readers. Definitely pay them. Their time and their emotional labor is valuable. And then, it is, especially if you want to be, doing the good work, there isn't a stupid question. Just, go ahead and ask, but do it respectfully. And I think, because I think the folks who are scared to address it, who aren't going to be willing to engage with it, then you're really hemmed in, and then your book isn't going to take and ask those questions that we're all saying is a part of our work here. And it's and you know, and we don't exist in a vacuum, and so don't be afraid to ask questions. All of us have social media presences. Ask us who we've used. We'll direct you to wonderful people.
And that leads into my final thing with all of you guys. I do want to thank everyone for coming, but let's go around and let them know where to find you on social media. And we'll start with you, Pip.
pjballantyne.com, and I share with T this thing called Ministry of Peculiar Occurrences.com, which you should be able to spell, because it took me a while to learn how to spell it.
All right, Leanna.
I am at LeannaReneHeiber.com. So here's my latest. It's the Spectral City. And I'm on Twitter at Leanna Rene. My third Spectral City book comes out very soon. As to when we're filming, it comes out July 21st. So A Summoning of Souls is coming up. It's one of my favorite books I've ever written. So I'm on Twitter most, but I also have a Facebook page as well as Instagram. If you go on to LeannaReneHeiber.com, you will find writers' resources as well. I have different things that have helped me through my career that I've linked to. So I have a blog with a bunch of resources. I also have free reads there, and also some other, tricks and for writers on my website. So there's also a contact page there if you have questions, as well as a mailing list. So thank you.
All right. Larry?
You can find me at larrynmartin.com, and on that site you will find our blogs, freebies. You will find links to Facebook, Twitter, and any other sites that we're currently doing. And normally you'd also find where we're going to be next, but right now we're going to be home.
Exactly.
Larry, tell Gail I love her.
I will do so.
All right, T.
Watch this. Okay, let's see if this is working. You should be looking at my website right
Fancy.
Yeah.
Fancy.
now. Yeah, I'm a
Tell me who's
nerd.
going to do that.
I'm a nerd, and this is what I
We
do.
look bad, T.
Yeah, I know, right? So this is my website, tmorris.com. And you also will reach through here every place that you can find me. You'll notice that you can find me on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter, on Twitch, on Discord, and even Untapped, in case you're looking to
Follow his
have a
drinking
brief-
habits.
all my drinking habits. You also see that along with Discord for Dummies, which is available everywhere wherever books are sold. You'll also see there's Podcasting for Dummies. Currently, the 3rd edition, 4th edition is coming out this fall. There's Twitch for Dummies. This is the beginning of the young adult series, The Curse of the Silver Pharaoh, which is currently available. So is its sequel, The Mystery of Emerald Flame. Currently, Pip and I are working on the 3rd book in the series, which is called Curse of the Monkey God.
No, it's not.
That was the title you told me. That was the title you told me.
The Curse of the Silver Pharaoh, The Mystery of Emerald Flame, and The Secret of the Monkey God.
It was the secret of the monkey god.
Yeah, the monkey god has a secret.
We got
He's not
too
gonna
many
tell you.
secrets, curses, and all that kind of crap.
We love him.
There's a monkey god in there somewhere. And while we're doing all that, we also are working. We are putting the final touches on it. It is the 2nd edition of Social Media for Writers. This was originally released by Writer's Digest, and then Writer's Digest went bye-bye. So because of that,
It wasn't us. We didn't kill it.
That wasn't us. Definitely wasn't us. But we also knew that we desperately needed to do a 2nd edition of Social Media for Writers. So that is coming out probably by the end of the summer. At the rate that we're going, it's going to be the end of the summer. And you can get all that through tmorris.com. Also,
right.
One last place you can find us that is not listed on this website is theshareddesk.com, which is our bi-weekly podcast, where we talk about the writer's lifestyle, whether it's collaboration, whether it's on our own, whether it's observations on the writer's lifestyle, and general geekery.
All right, great. Nancy.
Well, you can find me at nancynorthcott.com, and I spend far too much time on Twitter, way more than is good for me, and you can find me there under @NancyNorthcott. The 2nd Boar King book is in edits now and will be out this summer, and it further examines the mystery of the Princess in the Tower and climaxes at the Battle of Waterloo. So that'll be out sometime this summer, and I guess that's me.
All right, thank you. And Nikki.
So I have lots of places you can find me, whether it's books or chocolate. So for the book side, NikkiWoolfolk.com. You can also find me on Facebook. I never shut up. I tell stories about my husband, who is nicknamed Nerd. I talk about my kid. Well, on there, I end up saying like crap my kid says, but it's not the word crap. So Manashi, you'll see all my little stories there. So I'm on Facebook under Nikki Woolfolk. And when it comes to being on Twitter, same name, but then also for my chocolates, there is Belmont Chocolates, which I'm on Instagram. And sometimes I mention books, but usually you'll see pictures of food. On Twitter, for the chocolate side, you'll find Chocolate Bell. CHOCOLAT, Bell, with an E at the end. And also you can find the chocolate company on Facebook as well. And I also have BelmontChocolates.com. So pretty much everywhere. I don't shut up, and I do a lot of social media. So if not for anything, when I'm not writing, I'm usually pretty much talking about weird stories as well as my own with, shenanigans while I'm on Lunesta. So yeah, that one's always a fun one.
All right. Thank you so much again, everyone. It's been great. And I want to thank everyone for watching the panel room. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Jason. You're amazing.
Thank you.